A billionaire drove his beautiful fiancée to a crumbling old house in the middle of nowhere and quietly told her, "This is all I have left." He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was testing her love before their wedding. But the moment she stepped out of the car, her smile disappeared. Seconds later, she said something so heartless, so humiliating, that it crushed the man she claimed she loved. She believed she was walking away from a broke man. She never imagined that one decision would trigger the most devastating revenge of her life. Why did the billionaire choose that old house for the test? What shocking words came out of his fiancée's mouth? And what unbelievable move did he make that changed everything? 3 days earlier, the morning skyline of Manhattan shimmered beneath the first rays of sunlight as a black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided through the private entrance of Carter Innovations. Employees instinctively stepped aside. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply watched in admiration. The man stepping out of the car wasn't just another wealthy executive. He was Ethan Carter. At 34 years old, Ethan had built one of the largest artificial intelligence companies in America. Financial magazines estimated his net worth at over $11 billion. His investments stretched across technology, real estate, renewable energy, and private aviation. Television networks constantly invited him to speak about success, while business schools studied the strategies that had transformed a young man from poverty into one of the nation's youngest self-made billionaires. Yet none of those accomplishments had erased the quiet loneliness that followed him everywhere. As he crossed the marble lobby, dozens of employees greeted him. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." "Morning, sir. Congratulations on the engagement." He smiled politely at each of them. "Thank you." His smile looked genuine. It wasn't. The elevator doors closed, shutting out the noise of the lobby. For a brief moment, Ethan stood alone. His eyes drifted toward the engagement ring resting inside the small velvet box in his jacket pocket, not because he had forgotten to give it away. Olivia Brooks already wore the matching diamond on her finger. He carried the empty box because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. To everyone else, it symbolized the happiest day of his life. To Ethan, it represented hope. Hope that this time love had finally found him. Hope that this woman was different. The office doors opened on the top floor, revealing floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he had conquered through relentless determination. His chief financial officer, Daniel Harper, was already waiting. "Morning, Ethan." "Morning." Daniel handed him a stack of reports before hesitating. "Wedding planning going smoothly." Ethan chuckled. "I think Olivia has already picked out flowers for every room in the reception hall." Daniel laughed. "Sounds serious." "It is." There was warmth in Ethan's voice whenever he spoke her name. Daniel noticed it immediately. He had known Ethan for almost 15 years, long before magazine covers, billion-dollar valuations, and private jets. He had also watched every one of Ethan's previous relationships collapse under the weight of money. The memory lingered like an old scar. Years earlier, Ethan had fallen deeply in love with a fashion influencer named Vanessa. She often insisted that love mattered more than wealth, but within months of discovering the true scale of Ethan's fortune, her priorities quietly shifted. Conversations about family became conversations about luxury estates. Plans for simple vacations became demands for yachts and private islands. The relationship ended the afternoon. She secretly arranged a meeting with Ethan's attorneys, hoping to persuade him to transfer ownership of several investment properties before the wedding. He refused. She walked away. Another woman followed. Then another. Different faces. The same ending. Those painful experiences gradually changed Ethan in ways the public never noticed. He became cautious without becoming bitter, generous without becoming careless. successful without ever feeling completely secure. Then Olivia Brooks entered his life. Unlike the women before her, Olivia hadn't met Ethan at a luxury gala or exclusive business conference. She was an elementary school teacher in Brooklyn. Their paths crossed during a charity event organized for children from low-income families. Ethan had attended quietly, requesting that his name never appear on the donor list. Olivia spent the afternoon helping children choose backpacks, crayons, and books, never realizing the quiet man carrying supply boxes beside her was one of the richest people in America. That first meeting had stayed with Ethan ever since. She laughed easily. She spoke kindly to everyone. She never asked what he owned, only who he was. As their relationship grew, Olivia often repeated the same reassuring sentence whenever Ethan worried that his wealth complicated everything. "I'd still love you if you had nothing." Every single time, those words softened wounds she never knew existed. But love sometimes blinds even the wisest people. There was one person who never allowed herself to be blinded. Margaret Carter. Ethan's 80-year-old grandmother had raised him after a tragic car accident claimed both of his parents when he was only 12. Before wealth entered their lives, she and Ethan had lived together in a weathered farmhouse tucked deep in the Pennsylvania countryside. The roof leaked every winter. The porch sagged under the weight of time. During harsh seasons, they heated only 2 rooms because firewood was expensive. That old house had never represented shame. It represented survival. Every nail Ethan hammered into his future had been forged inside those cracked wooden walls. He had preserved the property exactly as it had been, not because he needed it, but because it reminded him where he came from. Very few people even knew it still existed. Margaret visited it every month. She cleaned it herself. She refused to let anyone renovate it. "The day this house looks rich," she once told Ethan, "is the day we forget who we were." Those words became part of him. 3 weeks ago, during the engagement celebration at the Carter family estate, Margaret quietly observed Olivia from across the room. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments. No obvious lies. Only tiny moments almost everyone overlooked. Olivia asked detailed questions about Ethan's investment portfolio. She became unusually interested when someone mentioned family trusts. When an elderly cousin reminisced about Ethan's childhood in the old farmhouse, Olivia quickly redirected the conversation toward vacation homes in Italy. None of those moments proved anything. Individually, they meant almost nothing. Together, they planted the first seed of doubt. Margaret said nothing that evening. She simply watched and waited. Neither Ethan nor Olivia realized that the future of their relationship had already begun changing in complete silence. The old farmhouse, forgotten by almost everyone, was about to become the stage upon which love, greed, betrayal, and revenge would collide. The engagement celebration continued long after sunset. Crystal chandeliers bathed the Carter estate in warm golden light, while a live orchestra played softly in the background. Politicians, celebrities, business executives, and old family friends moved through the ballroom with glasses of champagne, laughing as they congratulated the happy couple. Olivia Brooks looked like she belonged there. Her elegant white evening gown caught everyone's attention. The diamond engagement ring on her finger sparkled every time she lifted her hand. Guests complimented her beauty, and she accepted every compliment with a graceful smile. "You two are perfect together," one guest said. "You'll be America's favorite billionaire couple," another joked. Olivia laughed politely. "I just want a happy marriage." The answer sounded sincere. Ethan squeezed her hand. "So do I." From across the ballroom, Margaret Carter watched quietly. Unlike the other guests, she wasn't paying attention to Olivia's smile. She was studying everything around it. Years of hardship had taught Margaret that people often revealed themselves in the smallest moments. A hungry child looked at food differently from someone pretending to be hungry. A truthful person answered difficult questions differently from someone protecting a lie. She noticed Olivia's eyes drift whenever conversations turned toward money. Not once, several times. Earlier that evening, Ethan's uncle had proudly spoken about Carter Innovations, becoming the most valuable privately owned technology company in America. Olivia had immediately leaned closer. So Ethan still owns the majority of the company. The question sounded innocent. It wasn't inappropriate. But Margaret quietly stored it away. Later, another guest admired the Carter family estate. "What a beautiful home." Olivia smiled. "It really is." Then almost casually she asked, "Has Ethan always owned this property personally, or is it under the family trust?" Again, nothing alarming by itself. Yet Margaret noticed something else. Whenever conversations shifted away from wealth and toward Ethan himself, his childhood, his struggles, his late parents, Olivia contributed very little. But the moment investments, properties, or future plans entered the conversation, she became noticeably more engaged. Margaret had lived too long to ignore patterns. Across the room, Ethan was laughing with several business partners. Watching him brought back memories Margaret wished he had never experienced. Years ago, after selling his first company, Ethan had invited his then-girlfriend Vanessa to dinner. He had spoken excitedly about building schools in underserved communities. Vanessa barely acknowledged the idea. Instead, she spent 20 minutes discussing luxury watches she wanted him to buy. Another girlfriend had become obsessed with signing prenuptial paperwork before they had even chosen a wedding date. A third secretly hired investigators to estimate Ethan's hidden assets. Every heartbreak left him pretending he was fine. Margaret knew better. She had watched him cry once. Only once. The night Vanessa left. He believed no one had heard him. She had. That memory still hurt. The orchestra began playing a slower melody. Guests gathered near the dance floor. Ethan walked over to Margaret with 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You've been standing here all evening." "I'm old," Margaret smiled. "Watching is easier than dancing." Ethan chuckled. "You like Olivia, don't you?" Margaret looked toward the dance floor, where Olivia was laughing with several guests. "I think she's charming." The answer felt incomplete. Ethan noticed. "That's not what I asked." Margaret remained silent for several seconds. She had promised herself she would never interfere in Ethan's happiness unless she truly believed something was wrong. Finally she spoke. "Walk with me." They stepped away from the music and into the estate's quiet rose garden. The sounds of laughter faded behind them. Only the evening breeze remained. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. She simply admired the moonlight reflecting across the fountain. Then she reached into her sweater pocket. From it she removed an old brass key. Its surface was worn smooth from decades of use. Ethan recognized it instantly. "The farmhouse." Margaret placed it gently into his hand. "I visited yesterday." He smiled softly. "You still refuse to let anyone repair the porch." "It doesn't need perfection. It barely stands. It stood long enough to raise you." Ethan laughed quietly. "Fair point." The laughter disappeared when he noticed the seriousness in her eyes. "Why are you giving me this?" Margaret took a slow breath. "Because that house may save your life." Ethan frowned. "I don't understand." She looked directly into his eyes. I've watched Olivia carefully. So have I. No, Ethan. She shook her head gently. You've watched her with your heart. I've watched her with my experience. He remained silent. Margaret continued carefully, choosing every word. I'm not saying she's a bad woman. I'm saying I don't yet know whether she's in love with you. Or the life that comes with you. Ethan immediately shook his head. Grandma, I know what you're thinking. You think I've become suspicious because I'm old. No, I think you're wrong. Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she slowly turned toward the dark horizon. When your grandfather came home from the war, we owned nothing. She smiled faintly at the memory. Our roof leaked. Our refrigerator barely worked. Sometimes we shared one meal all day. But every night, he'd apologize for not giving me more. She looked back at Ethan. Do you know what I always told him? He quietly shook his head. I already had everything. Her eyes became moist. That's what love sounds like. Silence settled between them. Then Margaret spoke the words that would remain in Ethan's mind for weeks. If Olivia truly loves your heart, she'll love the man who once lived inside that farmhouse. She gently closed Ethan's fingers around the brass key. Take her there. Tell her you've lost everything. If she stays, you'll never have to doubt her again. Ethan stared at the key. The suggestion felt impossible. You want me to lie to the woman I'm going to marry. I want you to know the truth before you marry her. I can't test someone I love. No. Margaret nodded sadly. You can't afford not to. Those words landed heavily. Before Ethan could answer, Olivia stepped into the garden, smiling brightly. There you two are. She slipped her arm around Ethan. I've been looking everywhere. Margaret smiled politely. So have I. Olivia glanced briefly at the old brass key, still resting in Ethan's hand. What key is that? For the smallest fraction of a second, Margaret noticed something almost invisible. Curiosity. Not about its history. About what it might unlock. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Ethan casually slipped the key into his pocket. Oh, just something from my childhood. Olivia smiled and nodded. Neither she nor Ethan noticed Margaret's expression grow, even more thoughtful. Deep inside, the elderly woman felt a quiet unease she couldn't explain. She prayed she was wrong. Because if her instincts were right, the old farmhouse was about to expose far more than either of them was prepared to face. The brass key never left Ethan Carter's pocket. Over the next 3 weeks, he carried it everywhere. During board meetings, it rested inside the pocket of his tailored suit. During investor conferences, he absent-mindedly ran his thumb across its worn edges. At night, it sat on the bedside table of his Manhattan penthouse, catching the glow of the city lights outside his window. It was only an old key. Yet it had become heavier than any burden Ethan had ever carried. Margaret's words refused to leave his mind. If she truly loves your heart, she'll love the man who once lived inside that farmhouse. He wanted to dismiss the idea. He tried. Every time he looked at Olivia, she seemed to be exactly the woman he had fallen in love with. She called him every morning before school. She sent him pictures drawn by her students. She reminded him to take breaks from work whenever she knew he had long meetings. Sometimes she surprised him with homemade dinners instead of insisting on expensive restaurants. Everything about her appeared genuine. And yet, tiny moments began surfacing, moments Ethan had never paid attention to before. One Saturday afternoon, they toured a luxury wedding venue overlooking the ocean. The event coordinator smiled warmly. Would you like to see the ballroom first? Before Ethan could answer, Olivia spoke. Actually, we'd love to see the bridal suite. As they walked through the enormous room, Olivia laughed excitedly. I can already imagine our honeymoon pictures here. Ethan smiled. So can I. Then the coordinator casually mentioned another couple who had recently downsized their wedding after experiencing financial difficulties. Olivia's smile faded for just a second. That's awful. It is, Ethan agreed. She nodded sympathetically. I don't know how people survive losing everything. Her words sounded compassionate, but something about the way she said them lingered in Ethan's mind. Days later, they visited a luxury furniture showroom. Olivia wandered happily through the displays. This dining table is gorgeous. It is. We should order it after the wedding. Ethan glanced at the price tag. Nearly $80,000. He laughed softly. I think Grandma would faint if she saw that price. Olivia laughed too. Well, thankfully you're a billionaire. The sentence was playful. At least, it sounded playful. Still, Ethan found himself wondering whether he would have heard the same excitement if he weren't. He hated himself for even thinking that way. That night, guilt kept him awake. He sat alone on the balcony overlooking Manhattan, while memories replayed inside his mind. Vanessa, Rachel, Sophia, every woman who had promised forever before walking away when money became the center of the relationship. He closed his eyes. No, he whispered to himself. Olivia isn't like them. He desperately wanted that to be true. The following afternoon, Ethan drove to Pennsylvania without telling anyone. The old farmhouse stood exactly as he remembered. The porch leaned slightly. The paint had faded even more. Wildflowers surrounded the weathered fence. Nothing had changed. He unlocked the front door. The familiar scent of old wood and cedar filled the air. Dust floated through rays of sunlight streaming across the living room. His parents' photographs still rested on the fireplace mantel. His father's old rocking chair remained beside the window. His mother's handmade quilt still covered the small couch. Time seemed frozen. Ethan slowly walked through every room. Each step awakened another memory. His mother baking bread in the tiny kitchen. His father teaching him how to repair broken fence posts. Winter nights gathered around the fireplace while Margaret read stories aloud because they couldn't afford television. He smiled despite himself. This wasn't a broken house. It was the place that had built him. His smile disappeared when another memory surfaced. The day social workers arrived after his parents died. 12-year-old Ethan standing on this very porch with a small duffel bag. Margaret wrapping one arm around his shoulders, promising him they would survive together. They had. Against every odd. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He opened the door. Margaret stood outside, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. I figured you skipped lunch. Ethan smiled. You know me too well. I raised you. She stepped inside without another word. The two of them sat at the old kitchen table eating homemade chicken pot pie. For several minutes, neither mentioned the test. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I've been watching Olivia. Margaret looked up quietly. And I don't know. He rubbed his forehead. Sometimes I think you're wrong. Sometimes. He sighed heavily. I think I see what you saw. Margaret didn't celebrate. She didn't say, I told you so. Instead, she reached across the table and gently covered Ethan's hand with hers. That uncertainty, is exactly why you need the truth. I feel guilty. You should. He looked surprised. Margaret nodded. Testing someone you love should never feel comfortable. If it feels easy, you're doing it for the wrong reason. Ethan looked toward the window. So how do I live with lying to her? You don't. Margaret answered calmly. You live with discovering the truth. She stood and walked toward the living room. Stopping beside an old family photograph, she gently brushed dust from the frame. When your grandfather proposed to me, we owned less than what's inside this house. She smiled at the memory. He asked me if I'd regret marrying a man with empty pockets. What did you say? I told him, if we have honesty, we'll never truly be poor. She turned back toward Ethan. Never test someone because you're proud. Only test them when the truth will protect your future. Her words settled deep inside him. By the time Ethan locked the farmhouse that evening, his decision had finally been made. He wasn't trying to trap Olivia. He wasn't trying to humiliate her. He was trying to silence the one question that had haunted every relationship he'd ever had. Would she still choose him? If all he had left was this old house. As Ethan drove back toward New York, he called Olivia. She answered on the second ring. Hi, handsome. Her cheerful voice made him hesitate. Hi. I've been thinking. She laughed. About our honeymoon again. He forced a smile she couldn't see. No. I was thinking. Would you spend next weekend with me? Of course. I want to take you somewhere special. She sounded excited immediately. Ooh, is it a surprise? It is. I love surprises. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. I hope you still will. After ending the call, he glanced once more at the brass key resting in the cup holder. The decision had been made. Neither he nor Olivia realized that next weekend wouldn't simply test their love. It would determine whether they ever walked down the aisle or became enemies whose lives would never be the same again. Saturday arrived with clear blue skies stretching across New York. Ethan stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring at the city below. Usually, weekends with Olivia filled him with excitement. This morning, his chest felt unusually heavy. The brass key rested on the kitchen counter. He picked it up again. For a brief second, he almost canceled everything. He could still call Olivia and suggest a beach resort instead. He could throw the key away. Forget Margaret's warning. Pretend none of it had ever happened. Life would continue. Wedding invitations had already been designed. The venue had been reserved months in advance. Caterers, musicians, photographers, and florists were expecting the biggest society wedding of the year. One phone call could erase the entire test. His thumb hovered over Olivia's contact. Then another memory surfaced. Not a painful one. A confusing one. 2 nights earlier, Olivia had been scrolling through wedding blogs while Ethan answered emails on his laptop. Without looking up, she had suddenly asked, Honey, yeah, if something ever happened to you. He looked at her with a puzzled smile. What do you mean? Oh, nothing bad. She laughed lightly. I was just wondering if your companies automatically go to your wife, or if everything stays under the family trust. The question had caught him off guard. She quickly smiled. I know it sounds silly. I've never been around billionaire families. He accepted the explanation. But later that night, the conversation replayed in his head again and again. It wasn't enough to prove anything. Yet it joined the growing collection of small moments Margaret had warned him not to ignore. One clue meant nothing. 5 clues formed a pattern. Ethan slipped the brass key into his jacket pocket. Today, he would finally learn whether those clues pointed toward the truth, or merely toward his own fear. At exactly 10 o'clock, his black SUV rolled to a stop outside Olivia's apartment building in Brooklyn. She stepped outside wearing blue jeans, white sneakers, and a cream-colored sweater. She looked effortlessly beautiful. Her smile immediately softened Ethan's heart. She leaned through the driver's window and kissed him. "Good morning, future husband." "Good morning." She climbed inside. "I've been dying to know where we're going." "You'll find out." "Ooh, I like mysterious Ethan." He laughed. "Do you?" "I do." As they drove through the city, Olivia rested one hand on his arm. "I've been thinking about the wedding." "Already?" "I think we should invite more people." He smiled. "I thought we already had 300 guests." "I know." She laughed. "But your investors keep asking if they're invited. I don't even know half of them personally." "Maybe." She paused. "They could become important connections later." The sentence slipped out naturally. Almost too naturally. Ethan simply nodded. He didn't argue. He quietly stored it away. Nearly an hour later, skyscrapers disappeared behind them. Busy highways became smaller roads. Then smaller still. Olivia looked out the window. "I don't think I've ever been this far into the countryside." "You'll like it." "I trust you." Those 3 words struck Ethan harder than she realized. "I trust you." If only she knew how desperately he wanted to believe them. The road became increasingly narrow. Old farms replaced modern neighborhoods. Telephone poles stretched endlessly across open fields. Eventually, Olivia frowned. "Is the GPS wrong?" "No. We're almost there." She looked around curiously. "Does someone you know live out here?" Someone did. Before she could ask another question, the SUV turned onto a gravel driveway hidden behind tall oak trees. The tires crunched slowly over loose stones. Then the farmhouse came into view. Time had been kind to almost nothing about it. The white paint had faded into patches of gray. Several porch boards had warped with age. The wooden fence leaned unevenly. Tall grass surrounded the property. Only carefully tended flower beds near the porch hinted that someone still cared for the place. Olivia stared through the windshield. For several long seconds, she said absolutely nothing. Ethan watched her carefully. Not with suspicion. With hope. He wanted to see warmth. Curiosity. Compassion. Instead, confusion slowly spread across her face. "This," she forced a small smile, "is definitely unexpected." Ethan parked the SUV, but didn't turn off the engine immediately. He looked toward the house. "I grew up here." Olivia blinked. "You did?" He nodded. "My parents bought it before I was born." She looked back at the farmhouse. "I had no idea. I never talk about it." "Why not?" "Because after my parents died." He paused, memories tightening his throat. "My grandmother and I stayed here until I left for college." Olivia looked at him with sympathy. "I'm sorry. It wasn't easy." "No." She reached for his hand. "It couldn't have been." For a moment, Ethan felt guilty. Her concern seemed genuine. Was he making a terrible mistake? He almost abandoned the test right there. Then he remembered another detail. When he had mentioned losing his parents, Olivia comforted him. But she never asked a single question about them. Not where they were buried. Not what they had been like. Not what memories he still carried. Instead, her eyes slowly wandered back toward the house. "So," she asked carefully, "why did you bring me here today?" Ethan took a slow breath. His heartbeat echoed inside his ears. Everything after this moment would change their future forever. He reached into his pocket, wrapped his fingers around the old brass key, unlocked the front door, then quietly turned back toward the woman he intended to marry. "I want to show you where my life really began." Neither of them realized that before this day ended, one of them would lose the person they loved. The other would lose something far greater. Their mask. The old wooden door creaked open with a long, tired groan. Dust floated lazily through beams of sunlight pouring in from the small front windows. The scent of aged pine, cedar, and old books lingered in the air, carrying decades of memories trapped inside the walls. Ethan stepped inside first. He didn't see an abandoned house. He saw home. Every scratch on the wooden floor reminded him of childhood games with his father. Every faded photograph resting above the fireplace carried a memory no amount of money could replace. The worn rocking chair beside the window was where his mother used to read bedtime stories before illness and tragedy stole away the life they had built together. Olivia followed several steps behind. She hesitated before placing her foot on the wooden floor. Almost instinctively, she looked down at her expensive white sneakers. "I hope these don't get ruined." The words slipped out so naturally that she didn't seem to realize she had spoken them aloud. Ethan heard them. He forced a smile. "I'll sweep before we leave." She smiled politely. "Thanks." As they slowly walked through the living room, Ethan ran his fingers across the old fireplace mantel. His eyes settled on a faded family photograph. A much younger version of his father stood proudly beside his mother, both smiling as they held 6-year-old Ethan between them. Olivia glanced at the picture. "They look happy." They were. Ethan's voice softened. "My dad worked 2 jobs. My mom made extra money sewing clothes for neighbors. They never complained." He smiled at the memory. "When the roof leaked, Dad would put buckets everywhere and joke that we had indoor waterfalls." Olivia gave a small laugh. "He sounds funny." He was. Ethan carefully placed the photograph back exactly where it had rested for years. Narrative memories quietly unfolded inside him. He could almost hear his father's laughter echoing through the hallway. He remembered cold winters when his grandmother stretched every dollar until it seemed impossible for a family of 2 to survive. Those difficult years had shaped his deepest belief that a person's worth had nothing to do with what they owned. That belief was exactly why Margaret had insisted this house become the place where truth revealed itself. Olivia wandered toward the kitchen. It was small, very small. The old cabinets showed their age. The stove looked decades old, though Margaret kept everything remarkably clean. A simple wooden table stood near the window with 4 mismatched chairs surrounding it. "This is where you ate every meal." Ethan smiled. "Pretty much." She looked around slowly. "You never remodeled it." "No." "Why?" "Because it reminds me where I came from." She nodded. "I guess that's nice." Her answer felt strangely empty. She wasn't asking about the memories. She wasn't asking about his parents. Instead, her attention kept drifting toward the condition of the house itself. As they moved upstairs, Olivia noticed the narrow hallway. The ceilings are really low. They were built that way. The bedrooms must be tiny. They are. She opened the first bedroom. Inside sat an old wooden bed, a bookshelf filled with worn novels, and a desk Ethan had built with his grandfather when he was 13. He smiled. I studied for college entrance exams right here. Olivia glanced around for barely 5 seconds before walking back into the hallway. She seemed far more interested in exploring the rest of the house than understanding its memories. Ethan quietly noticed. He didn't judge. Not yet. He simply observed. Exactly as Margaret had taught him. One small moment never told the whole story. But a pattern eventually would. They eventually stepped back downstairs. Olivia stood near the front window, looking out across the overgrown yard. It must be worth something. Ethan looked at her. What? The land. She pointed toward the surrounding acreage. There's quite a bit of it. He answered honestly. About 40 acres. Her eyebrows lifted. Really? Most of it's forest. Have developers ever offered to buy it? Ethan nodded. A few times. And I always said no. She turned to face him. You could probably make millions selling it. I know. So why keep it? Ethan smiled faintly. Some things are worth more than money. For just a brief instant. Disappointment flickered across Olivia's face. It disappeared almost immediately. She smiled again. I guess you're sentimental. I am. Outside, the wind gently rattled the old porch swing. Inside, silence settled between them. Ethan looked around the house one last time. This place had witnessed every important chapter of his early life. His happiest memories. His deepest losses. His greatest dreams. Now, it was about to witness something else. The moment that would determine whether the woman standing in front of him truly loved the man, or only the billionaire he had become. He took one slow breath. His pulse quickened. Everything until now had simply been preparation. The real test was about to begin. The silence inside the farmhouse stretched longer than either of them expected. Outside, a gentle breeze rustled the tall grass surrounding the old property. Somewhere in the distance, birds sang as if nothing in the world was about to change. Inside, Ethan Carter's heartbeat pounded so loudly that it almost drowned out every other sound. He looked around the living room one more time. The faded photographs. The worn fireplace. The handmade quilt his mother had sewn years before her death. This house had witnessed poverty. It had witnessed grief. It had witnessed hope. Now, it was about to witness truth. Ethan slowly turned toward Olivia. There's something I need to tell you. She smiled. You've been acting nervous all morning. I know. What is it? He took a deep breath. Everything in him wanted to stop. Everything in him wanted to tell her the truth, drive back to New York, and forget this terrible idea forever. But another voice reminded him of Margaret's warning. If you marry the wrong person, you'll spend years paying for one day of certainty you refuse to seek. He swallowed hard. My company is in serious trouble. Olivia frowned. What do you mean? Carter Innovations. He lowered his eyes. Is collapsing. She stared at him. For a few seconds, she didn't react at all. Almost as though her mind refused to process the sentence. What? Our biggest acquisition failed. He continued carefully, making the lie believable rather than dramatic. Then several investors pulled out. The banks demanded immediate repayment. Our stock-backed loans were called in. I tried to save the company. I couldn't. Olivia blinked repeatedly. I don't understand. I've spent the last few weeks trying to fix everything. You never said anything. I didn't want to worry you until I knew the outcome. She forced a weak smile. So, this is temporary, right? Ethan remained silent. That silence answered the question before he spoke. I've sold almost everything. Her smile disappeared. The penthouse. Gone. The beach house in Malibu. Sold. The Aspen cabin. Sold. The private jet. Sold. The investment properties. Liquidated. Each answer landed like another stone sinking into deep water. Olivia's breathing became noticeably slower. What about? She hesitated. Your savings. I used them trying to keep the company alive. The room fell silent again. Ethan could almost hear his own pulse. He had imagined this conversation dozens of times. He had hoped Olivia would step toward him, hold his hand, tell him none of it mattered. Instead, she simply stood there, looking at him, looking around the room, then back at him again. Finally, she asked quietly, So, what happens now? Ethan pointed gently toward the old farmhouse. This. She frowned. What do you mean? This house. He paused. Is all I have left. The words echoed through the room. Olivia looked around again. Her eyes moved across the cracked walls. The aging furniture. The tiny kitchen. The worn staircase. The silence lasted nearly 15 seconds. Then she laughed. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just one short laugh. The kind people make when they assume they've misunderstood something. You're joking. Ethan slowly shook his head. I'm not. She waited for him to smile. He didn't. She searched his face for any hint that this was a prank. There was none. Ethan. Her voice became uneasy. You're serious. I wish I wasn't. He reached for her hand. We'll get through it. She didn't immediately take it. I know this isn't the life we planned. No. She whispered almost absent-mindedly. It isn't. We'll rebuild. He finally took her hand. It won't happen overnight. But I've started from nothing before. I can do it again. We can do it together. Olivia slowly pulled her hand away. Not angrily. Almost instinctively. As though touching him suddenly felt different. Ethan noticed. His heart tightened. Still, he refused to jump to conclusions. People processed shocking news differently. Some cried. Some became silent. Some needed time. He reminded himself not to judge too quickly. That very thought reflected the lesson Margaret had taught him. Never decide someone's character from a single emotional moment. So he waited, giving Olivia room to absorb everything. She slowly walked toward the front window, crossing her arms, staring outside at the overgrown fields. Narrative memories quietly surfaced within her. Growing up, Olivia had watched her mother work endless shifts after her father abandoned the family under crushing debt. She remembered eviction notices taped to apartment doors, utility bills they couldn't pay, and nights when embarrassment outweighed hunger. As a teenager, she promised herself she would never again live a life controlled by financial insecurity. That promise had slowly transformed into an obsession she rarely admitted, even to herself. When she met Ethan, his kindness attracted her. His success reassured her. Over time, those two feelings became so tightly intertwined that she no longer knew where one ended and the other began. Now, standing inside the farmhouse, she felt an old fear returning. Not fear of Ethan. Fear of becoming poor again. Ethan watched her quietly. He mistook that fear for disappointment. He still believed love might overcome it. He had no idea that another battle was already taking place inside Olivia's mind. Finally, she turned toward him. Her expression had changed. The warmth that had filled her eyes all morning had faded into something Ethan couldn't quite recognize. When she spoke again, her voice sounded colder than he had ever heard before. "So, you expect us to live here?" The question hung in the air. Ethan nodded slowly. "If that's what it takes until I build everything back." For the first time since arriving, Olivia didn't even try to smile. And in that single moment, the first crack appeared in the future they had spent a year planning together. Olivia didn't answer immediately. She slowly turned away from Ethan and walked across the living room again, her footsteps echoing against the worn wooden floor. She paused in front of the fireplace, then glanced toward the kitchen before looking up at the ceiling, where the exposed beams showed decades of age. The silence became suffocating. Ethan didn't interrupt it. He remembered Margaret's words. Don't rescue people from uncomfortable moments. Sometimes silence tells the truth better than questions. So he waited. He wanted Olivia to speak from her heart, not from pressure. She folded her arms tightly across her chest. "So you're saying," she began carefully, "that after everything we've planned, this is our future?" "For now," Ethan replied gently, "not forever." She looked around the room again. "This house?" "Yes. We'll fix it together. I know it isn't luxurious, but—" She cut him off. "Fix it." Her voice carried a faint laugh. "You think fixing it is enough?" Ethan remained calm. "I've rebuilt my life once before. I can do it again." "I don't doubt that." "Then what's wrong?" Olivia looked directly into his eyes. "Everything." The word landed like a punch. Ethan blinked but said nothing. She took several slow steps toward him. "When we got engaged, I thought we were building a certain kind of life." "We were." "No." She shook her head. "I thought we were." Her emphasis unsettled him. "What does that mean?" "It means—" She searched for the right words. "I didn't picture spending my life in a place like this." "You wouldn't. It would only be temporary." "You don't know that." "I do." "How?" "Because I know myself. You've always told me that. And it's true." He spoke with quiet confidence. "I started with nothing. I can build everything again." Olivia stared at him for several seconds. Then she asked a question that made his stomach tighten. "How many years?" "What?" "How many years would it take?" "I don't know." 5. Maybe. 10. "I honestly don't know." "What if you never recover?" The question wasn't unreasonable, but the way she asked it, it sounded less like concern and more like calculation. Ethan answered honestly. "Then we'll still have each other." She lowered her eyes. He waited for her to smile. Instead, she slowly backed away from him. "No." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I can't do this." "We can." "No, Ethan. I can't." He stepped closer. "We've faced problems before. Not like this. We'll figure it out." She laughed softly. There was no warmth in it. "You still don't understand." "Help me understand." She looked around the room once more. "This house." She pointed toward the cracked walls. "This isn't the life I want." Ethan spoke quietly. "This house kept my family alive. I'm grateful it did. But I don't want to live here. We don't have another choice." "You don't." The sentence slipped out before she could stop herself. Both of them froze. She realized what she had just implied. Ethan heard it too. You don't. She quickly looked away. I didn't mean it like that. Then what did you mean? She hesitated. Narrative memories flashed through Olivia's mind. At 16, she had stood beside her mother as movers carried their furniture onto a sidewalk after an eviction. She remembered classmates whispering when they discovered she had transferred schools because her family could no longer afford rent in their old neighborhood. Those humiliations had shaped her determination to never struggle financially again. Over the years, that determination quietly transformed into a belief that love alone could never guarantee security. She rarely admitted it, even to herself, because she genuinely cared for Ethan. Yet deep inside, she had also come to depend on the certainty his fortune represented. The fear of returning to poverty now overwhelmed everything else. Ethan couldn't see those memories. He only saw the woman he loved pulling farther away with every passing second. He tried one last time. Olivia. He reached for her hand. She stepped backward before he could touch it. The movement lasted barely a second. But it hurt more than any words. His hand remained suspended in the air. Slowly, he lowered it. I love you. His voice cracked. We'll get through this. She looked at him with conflicted eyes. For one brief moment, he thought she was about to cry. Instead, she inhaled deeply. Then the softness disappeared from her face, almost like a door quietly closing forever. I've spent my whole life trying to escape this kind of future. She gestured around the farmhouse. I won't walk back into it. This isn't just a house. Ethan replied. It's my family's history. It's your history. She answered. Not mine. Another painful silence settled between them. Outside, the old porch swing creaked gently in the wind. Inside, Ethan felt something inside his heart beginning to crack. Yet he still refused to believe this was the end. He convinced himself she was overwhelmed. That fear was talking, not her true heart. He had one final hope. If he remained patient, if he reminded her of everything they had built together, she would choose love over fear. He looked into her eyes one more time, completely unaware that the cruelest words he would ever hear were only moments away. Ethan looked at Olivia with the same tenderness he had shown her since the day they met. Even now, even after the distance growing between them, he refused to believe the woman standing in front of him could intentionally break his heart. He took a slow step forward. Olivia. His voice was calm. I know this is overwhelming. I know this isn't the future we imagined. But we've spent an entire year planning a life together. He smiled faintly. Not a lifestyle. A life. She didn't answer. He continued. When we first met, neither of us talked about money. We talked about books. The kids in your classroom. The little coffee shop where we had our first date. You used to tell me happiness wasn't something money could buy. I believed you. Olivia lowered her eyes. For a brief moment, guilt flickered across her face. It was gone almost immediately. Ethan, she said quietly. People change. He shook his head. No. They reveal themselves. The words escaped him without thinking. The moment he said them, he remembered Margaret saying exactly the same thing years ago. Olivia crossed her arms. I've been trying to be realistic. So am I. No. She looked directly into his eyes. You're being emotional. And you're pretending this isn't a disaster. It is a disaster, he admitted. But disasters don't last forever. My parents lost everything once. They rebuilt. My grandmother survived with almost nothing. She never gave up. I won't either. And I don't expect you to. Olivia replied. She paused. I don't want that life. You wouldn't be living that life alone. We'd face it together. Again. Silence. Ethan searched her face for the woman he had fallen in love with. The teacher who comforted frightened children. The woman who cried while accepting his proposal. The woman who always squeezed his hand and whispered, "I'd still love you if you had nothing." He smiled sadly. "You remember something you used to tell me." She looked away. "What?" "You said." His voice softened. "I'd still love you if you had nothing." The room became perfectly still. Olivia closed her eyes. Only for a second. When she opened them again, something had changed. The compassion was gone. The hesitation was gone. The conflict was gone. She laughed. Not nervously. Not awkwardly. Cruelly. A sharp laugh that echoed through the old farmhouse. Ethan stared at her. Confused. She slowly shook her head. "I can't believe you actually remembered that." His chest tightened. "What?" "I said what you wanted to hear." The sentence hit him so hard that he forgot to breathe. "What are you talking about?" She looked around the room with open disgust. "This," she pointed toward the cracked walls, "is exactly why people need money. You think love pays bills. Ethan, you've been living in a fantasy." He stared at her in disbelief. "I wasn't lying when I said I cared about you." She continued. "But I also cared about the future. The future we were supposed to have. We still can." "No," she answered immediately. "We can't." He swallowed hard. "Because I'm broke." She didn't respond. He asked again. "Answer me." Finally, she did. "Yes." The single word crushed every remaining hope inside him. He took another slow breath, trying to steady himself. "So if I have nothing, you don't want me." She didn't deny it. Instead, she walked toward the front door, stopped, turned around, then looked him straight in the eyes. "I didn't agree to marry a poor man." The words echoed through the farmhouse. Every photograph, every memory, every promise they had ever made, seemed to collapse in that instant. Ethan felt as though the air had been ripped from his lungs. Still, he refused to give up. He stepped toward her again. "Money isn't who I am." "It is now," she answered coldly. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." She laughed bitterly. "I've worked too hard to escape poverty. I'm not going back. We won't be poor forever. You don't know that. I know who I am." She smiled. "But I know who I am too." For the first time, her honesty sounded more frightening than any lie. She slowly removed the diamond engagement ring from her finger. Ethan's eyes widened. "Olivia." She looked at the ring for a long moment. "I used to think this represented my future." Her fingers tightened. "Now, it just reminds me of a mistake." Without another word, she tossed it. The ring struck the old wooden floor. It bounced once, twice, then rolled beneath the rocking chair that had belonged to Ethan's late mother. The The tiny metallic sound seemed deafening inside the silent house. Ethan instinctively looked toward the chair. His mother's chair. The same chair where she had read bedtime stories. The same chair she sat in during her final Christmas. Now, the engagement ring rested beneath it like another broken promise. Neither of them spoke. For several endless seconds. The only sound was the old grandfather clock ticking softly in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Then Olivia delivered the sentence Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. I deserve someone who can give me the life I want. She opened the front door. Bright sunlight flooded into the room. Without looking back, she stepped outside. Ethan remained frozen. His eyes slowly drifted toward the ring lying beneath his mother's rocking chair. He bent down, reached underneath, picked it up carefully. His hand trembled. His heart was breaking. But somewhere beneath the pain, something else had begun to awaken. Not anger. Not yet. A quiet realization. The test was over, and the truth had finally revealed itself. Outside, the sound of an approaching engine suddenly echoed down the gravel driveway. Olivia looked toward the entrance of the property. Then, for the first time that day, she smiled. The sound of the approaching engine grew louder with every passing second. Gravel crunched beneath heavy tires as a sleek black luxury SUV emerged from behind the line of oak trees and rolled confidently toward the farmhouse. Ethan stood just inside the open front door, the engagement ring still resting in his trembling hand. He frowned. He hadn't invited anyone. The vehicle came to a smooth stop a few feet from the porch. The driver's door opened. A tall man wearing an expensive charcoal suit and dark sunglasses stepped out. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to wealth and attention. Ethan recognized him almost immediately. Brandon Hayes, a successful real estate developer. Their paths had crossed at charity galas, investment summits, and fundraising dinners over the years. They had never been friends, but they knew each other well enough to exchange polite greetings whenever they met. Seeing Brandon here, at this house, made no sense. Until Ethan looked at Olivia. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't confused. She looked relieved. Brandon removed his sunglasses and smiled at her. There you are. His voice was warm. Familiar. Far too familiar. Olivia walked down the porch steps without hesitation. You got here fast. I left as soon as you texted. Texted. The word echoed inside Ethan's mind. Brandon reached her. Without asking. Without hesitating. He wrapped one arm around Olivia's waist. Then, he kissed her. Not a quick greeting. Not an awkward mistake. A long, comfortable kiss between two people who clearly knew each other well. Ethan felt the world stop. He stared at them, unable to process what he was seeing. Olivia didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled at Brandon the same way she used to smile at Ethan. Brandon glanced toward the porch. So, he said with a smirk, I guess the fairy tale's over. Ethan slowly stepped outside. What is this? Neither of them answered immediately. Olivia folded her arms and looked at Ethan with eyes that no longer held even the smallest trace of affection. I guess you deserve the truth now. His throat tightened. What truth? She exhaled slowly. I've been seeing Brandon. The words landed like a hammer. For how long? She looked at Brandon before answering. Almost 4 months. Ethan's face drained of color. 4 months. His mind raced backward. 4 months ago. They had been tasting wedding cakes, meeting photographers, finalizing honeymoon plans. 4 months ago. He had been telling the world he was marrying the woman of his dreams. Narrative memories suddenly resurfaced with painful clarity. At a charity gala 3 months earlier, Ethan had noticed Brandon greeting Olivia with surprising familiarity. Brandon had casually said, "Good seeing you again," before quickly changing the subject when Ethan approached. Later that evening, Olivia dismissed it, explaining that they had briefly met during another fundraising event. Ethan believed her without another thought. Then there was the business awards banquet. Olivia had stepped outside twice to answer phone calls. She returned saying they were from a fellow teacher organizing school activities. Ethan never questioned her. He trusted her completely. Now, those scattered moments aligned like pieces of a puzzle he had never realized he was solving. "You were cheating on me." His voice barely rose above a whisper. Olivia shrugged. "I was keeping my options open." "You were engaged to me." "I was," she answered without remorse. Brandon laughed quietly. "Don't act so shocked." Ethan turned sharply toward him. "You stay out of this." Brandon took one confident step forward. "I don't think I will." He slipped both hands into his pockets. "The truth is, I told Olivia not to rush into marriage." Ethan clenched his jaw. "What are you talking about?" Brandon smiled. "I told her to wait until everything was legally secure." "What?" Olivia answered this time. "If we got married before your assets were properly shared, I'd have no protection." The sentence stunned Ethan. "Protection? You call that protection?" She met his eyes. "I call it being smart." Brandon nodded approvingly. "I've been through divorce. You'd be surprised how many wealthy people hide assets." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So this was your plan?" Olivia didn't deny it. "We weren't going to do anything illegal." She spoke as though explaining something perfectly reasonable. "I just wasn't going to marry someone without making sure our future was protected." "Our future?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "There was never an hour, was there?" She remained silent. That silence became its own answer. Brandon placed a reassuring hand on Olivia's shoulder. "Relax." He looked at Ethan with open arrogance. "You don't have anything left anyway. So none of this matters now." Ethan's fingers tightened around the engagement ring until the edges pressed painfully into his palm. His heart screamed at him to walk away, to leave, to never look at either of them again. But another part of him needed answers. One question in particular. He looked directly at Olivia. Every word felt heavier than the last. "Did you ever?" His voice cracked. "Love me at all?" For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse. Olivia didn't answer immediately. A strange expression crossed her face. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then it disappeared. What she said next would leave wounds far deeper than betrayal itself. For a long moment, Olivia simply looked at Ethan. The wind stirred loose strands of her hair as silence settled over the old farmhouse. Even Brandon stopped smiling, curious about how she would answer. Ethan stood perfectly still. His entire future depended on a single sentence. "Did you ever," he repeated softly, "love me at all?" Olivia lowered her eyes. For the briefest instant, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Not love. Not regret. Calculation. Narrative memories flashed through her mind. The afternoon she first met Ethan at the charity event, she genuinely liked him. He was humble, attentive, and unlike the arrogant wealthy men she had occasionally encountered. Weeks later, after discovering he was a billionaire, she convinced herself that loving him and loving the life he could provide were not mutually exclusive. As the months passed, however, the security his fortune promised slowly overshadowed everything else. By the time Brandon entered the picture, she had begun measuring every decision through the lens of financial certainty rather than emotional commitment. She had quietly crossed a line without admitting it to herself. She looked back at Ethan. "I cared about you." The words offered him a tiny spark of hope. Then she extinguished it. "But I loved the life you represented more." Ethan closed his eyes. It felt as though every promise she had ever whispered had just turned into ash. "You lied to me." "I told myself I wasn't lying." She answered calmly. "I thought I could have both. And when I thought you had nothing." She shrugged. There was nothing left to stay for. Brandon chuckled. "I told you she'd eventually tell you the truth." Ethan slowly opened his eyes. "You knew." Brandon nodded without shame. "From the beginning." "What do you mean?" "The first time Olivia told me she was dating America's favorite billionaire, I congratulated her." He smiled arrogantly. "But I also told her to be careful." "Careful of what?" "Careful not to settle too quickly." Olivia folded her arms. "I wanted to know exactly what kind of future I was marrying into." "So while you were planning our wedding?" Ethan's voice trembled. "You were planning something else." She didn't deny it. "We delayed setting a wedding date more than once." She spoke matter-of-factly. "I wanted more time." Narrative exposition tied together earlier clues. Ethan suddenly remembered how Olivia repeatedly postponed meetings with his attorneys whenever they discussed routine financial planning for marriage. She always claimed she was overwhelmed with work or school events. At the time, her explanation sounded reasonable. Now, those delays aligned with Brandon's advice to wait until she better understood Ethan's financial structure. What had once seemed like harmless scheduling conflicts now formed a coherent pattern rather than an unbelievable twist. "You were investigating my finances," Ethan whispered. "I was protecting my future." Olivia replied. "No." He shook his head slowly. "You were pricing my worth." Brandon laughed louder. "Now you're getting it." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "You know what's funny?" He scrolled through several messages. "She almost broke things off with me after your proposal." Olivia frowned. "Brandon." "What?" He grinned. "He deserves to know." Brandon turned the phone toward Ethan. "I told her to marry you." Olivia's eyes widened. "Stop. You were the one who didn't listen." Brandon smirked. "I said marry him first. Everything else can be figured out later." Ethan stared at the screen. He didn't need to read every message. The conversation alone made him sick. Brandon slipped the phone back into his pocket. "But then your little bankruptcy story ruined the plan." He laughed. "I guess life has a sense of humor." Olivia looked at Ethan without the slightest hint of embarrassment. "If you'd told me the truth about your finances earlier, maybe none of this would have happened." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "The truth? I built my entire life around honesty. And I built mine around security." She answered. "We wanted different things." "No," he said quietly. "I wanted a wife. You wanted a wallet." Her expression hardened. "I wanted stability. You wanted wealth." He corrected. There was no anger in his voice anymore. Only disappointment. The kind that cuts deeper than rage. If you've been following Ethan's heartbreaking journey and want to see how the truth changes everything, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Brandon looked around the property with open contempt. So this is really all you've got left? Ethan didn't answer. Brandon laughed again. I've seen storage sheds in better condition. Olivia joined him. I can't believe I almost became the lady of this place. The two of them laughed together. The sound echoed across the quiet fields. Ethan looked back at the farmhouse. His childhood home. The place where his parents had taught him integrity. The place where his grandmother still swept the porch every month because memories mattered more than appearances. They weren't mocking an old house. They were mocking every sacrifice that had built the man standing before them. For the first time that afternoon, the heartbreak inside Ethan began changing into something colder. Not blind rage. Not reckless revenge. Something far more dangerous. Clarity. He slowly opened his hand. The engagement ring rested in his palm. He looked at it one final time, then calmly slipped it into his pocket. Olivia mistook his silence for defeat. Brandon mistook it for weakness. Neither of them noticed the subtle change in Ethan's eyes. The broken man standing before them was disappearing. In his place stood the billionaire who had spent his entire life surviving impossible odds. And although they believed they had just destroyed him, they had actually given him the one thing he needed most. The truth. What they still didn't know was that the farmhouse held a secret neither of them could possibly imagine. And Ethan had just decided they would both pay for what they had done. The laughter slowly faded into the distance. Brandon looked at his watch before glancing back at Ethan with a smug grin. Well, he said, I guess this little fairy tale is over. He opened the passenger door of the SUV for Olivia. She smiled at him, then turned to Ethan one last time. I never imagined it would end like this. Ethan stood motionless on the porch. The engagement ring rested inside his closed fist. His face was pale, but his voice remained steady. Neither did I. Olivia expected more. She expected him to beg, to ask her to stay, to promise that he would earn everything back. Instead, he simply looked at her. That calmness unsettled her. It wasn't the reaction she had rehearsed in her mind. Brandon noticed it too. What happened, he mocked, cat got your tongue. Ethan ignored him. Instead, he looked directly at Olivia. I have one last question. She sighed impatiently. What now? If I'd never become a billionaire? If we'd met when I was still living in this farmhouse? If I had nothing but this house? Would you have fallen in love with me? Silence. Even Brandon stopped smiling for a moment. Olivia looked around the property. The peeling paint. The aging porch. The crooked fence. The rusty mailbox. Then she looked back at Ethan. Her answer came without hesitation. No. The word echoed through the quiet countryside. Not because she shouted it, but because there was absolutely no regret behind it. Ethan lowered his head. A deep breath escaped his lips. When he finally looked back at her, there were tears in his eyes. Not tears of weakness. Tears for the future he thought they were building together. I appreciate your honesty. Olivia frowned. You're thanking me. Yes. Why? Because if you'd hidden this until after our wedding, it would have destroyed far more than today. She rolled her eyes. You'll get over it. I will. He answered quietly. But you'll always remember today. Brandon laughed loudly. I doubt she'll remember this place by tomorrow. Ethan slowly reached into his jacket pocket. Brandon instinctively stiffened. For a split second, he wondered whether Ethan had a weapon. Instead, Ethan pulled out the old brass key. He stared at it silently. Narrative exposition unfolded gently. The key had opened this farmhouse for decades, but to Margaret Carter, it represented something much greater. It symbolized every sacrifice the Carter family had endured before success ever found them. Margaret had deliberately preserved the farmhouse in its original condition because she believed true character revealed itself most clearly in places where appearances offered nothing to gain. That belief had guided her entire life. And now, standing on the same porch where she had once comforted a grieving 12-year-old Ethan after his parents' funeral, she unknowingly watched it prove true once again. Brandon chuckled, still carrying that useless old thing. Ethan closed his hand around it. My grandfather carried this key until the day he died. So, it reminds me that things with the greatest value don't always look valuable. Brandon smirked. Keep telling yourself that. Olivia folded her arms. Ethan, I genuinely hope you rebuild your life. But I won't be part of it. I understand. His calm response confused her again. Why wasn't he angry? Why wasn't he chasing after her? She had expected heartbreak. She hadn't expected peace. A tiny seed of uncertainty quietly settled inside her mind. She quickly buried it. Brandon climbed behind the steering wheel. Come on. We've wasted enough time. Olivia nodded. She opened the passenger door. Before getting in, she looked back one final time. Ethan was still standing on the porch, watching, not with hatred, not with desperation, simply watching. The SUV pulled away, disappearing slowly down the gravel driveway. Dust rose behind the tires until both the vehicle and its occupants vanished beyond the trees. Silence returned. Only the wind remained. Ethan looked down at the engagement ring resting in his palm. He walked back inside the farmhouse. Without saying a word, he placed the ring inside the same wooden drawer where his late father had once kept family keepsakes. Then he closed the drawer. It felt like burying an entire future. Minutes later, an old blue pickup truck rolled into the driveway. Margaret Carter stepped out carrying a picnic basket. She had planned to surprise Ethan and Olivia with homemade lunch, hopping to meet the woman who would soon become her granddaughter one more time before the wedding. The moment she saw Ethan standing alone on the porch, she stopped walking. She didn't ask where Olivia was. She didn't ask what had happened. One look at Ethan's face told her everything. She slowly climbed the porch steps. Without saying a word, she wrapped both arms around him. For the first time all day, Ethan broke. The man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, who had survived the deaths of his parents, who had built an empire from nothing, quietly cried against his grandmother's shoulder. Margaret gently rubbed his back. I was praying I'd been wrong. So was I. He whispered. After several moments, he stepped back and wiped his eyes. No one has ever made me feel this small. Margaret looked toward the empty driveway. No, she said softly. She only revealed how small she truly is. Ethan took a long breath. I loved her. I know. I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. I know. I would have given her everything. Margaret nodded. And that's exactly why God let you discover the truth before it was too late. Ethan looked toward the attic ceiling. His grandfather's words suddenly echoed in his memory. If the day ever comes when you don't know who deserves your trust, go to the attic. What I left there isn't just wealth, it's wisdom. He hadn't thought about those words in years. As a teenager, he had assumed his grandfather was talking about old family letters or forgotten heirlooms. Now, for the first time, he wondered if there was something more. Margaret noticed him staring upward. "You remember, didn't you?" Ethan slowly nodded. "The attic." Margaret smiled faintly. "Your grandfather always said the day you'd need it would also be the day you'd finally understand it." Ethan tightened his grip on the old brass key. The heartbreak was still there. The betrayal was still fresh. But beneath the pain, a new determination had begun to grow. Olivia believed she had walked away from a broken man. She had no idea. She had just awakened the man capable of exposing every lie she and Brandon had ever hidden. And before this was over, their greatest fear would no longer be losing money. It would be facing the truth they never thought anyone would uncover. The farmhouse fell silent again. The wind whispered through the old oak trees, gently rocking the weathered porch swing where Ethan's father used to sit after long days of work. Every sound seemed louder now that Olivia's laughter and Brandon's SUV had disappeared into the distance. Ethan stood on the porch, staring down the empty gravel road. Only a few hours earlier, he had arrived hopping to prove his grandmother wrong. Instead, she had been right about everything. He slowly opened his hand. The old brass key rested in his palm. Its worn edges caught the afternoon sunlight, reminding him of every time his grandfather had locked the farmhouse before leaving for work. As a boy, Ethan had often wondered why his grandfather treated such an ordinary key like a priceless treasure. Now he finally understood. Some keys didn't simply unlock doors. They unlocked truth. Margaret stepped beside him, quietly carrying the picnic basket back into the house. "You haven't eaten all day," she said softly. "I'm not hungry." "I know." She placed the basket on the kitchen table. "But your grandfather always said people should never make important decisions on an empty stomach." Despite everything, Ethan managed the faintest smile. He really did say that. He also said something else. Margaret looked toward the ceiling. "He said there would come a day when this house would show you who truly deserved a place in your life." Ethan followed her gaze. The attic. For years he had ignored it. As a child, he wasn't allowed to climb up there alone. After his grandfather passed away, life became consumed by school, college, building companies, and eventually creating a business empire. The attic simply became another forgotten corner of the house. Until now, a memory surfaced with startling clarity. He was 12 years old, sitting beside his grandfather on the front porch after helping repair a section of the fence. His grandfather had rested a hand on his shoulder and said, "People will admire you for what you own. Very few will stay because of who you are. When you can no longer tell the difference, come back to this house. The answer will already be waiting." At the time, Ethan had assumed the old man was speaking in riddles. Standing there now, the words felt painfully literal. Margaret walked to the hallway closet and retrieved an old wooden ladder. Together, they carried it beneath the attic opening. The brass key trembled slightly in Ethan's hand as he unlocked the small hatch. It clicked open. A faint smell of cedar drifted down. He climbed first. The attic was untouched. Old trunks lined one wall. Handmade furniture covered with white sheets rested in neat rows. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight entering from a tiny round window. Everything looked exactly as it had decades earlier. Margaret climbed up behind him. Without saying a word, she pointed toward a large cedar chest tucked beneath the far wall. I've never opened it. Ethan looked surprised. You had the key. I had permission to protect it. She smiled gently. Not to open it. He slowly walked toward the chest. Its brass lock matched the old key perfectly. His heartbeat quickened. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt as though his grandfather were standing beside him. He inserted the key. The lock turned smoothly. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid. Inside were carefully organized leather-bound journals, several sealed envelopes, family photographs, property records, and a small velvet pouch. On top rested one envelope. Across the front, written in his grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were just 7 words. For Ethan, when you finally know. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. My dear grandson, if you're reading this, life has already taught you the lesson I hoped it never would, that wealth attracts many people, but character reveals very few. I prayed you would never need this letter. But if you do, then remember this. Never mourn the people who walk away when your fortune disappears. Thank God they left before discovering what your heart is truly worth. Tears quietly rolled down Ethan's face. Margaret turned away, giving him privacy. He continued reading. This farmhouse was never your greatest inheritance. The values you learned inside it were. Money built your companies. Character built the man who created them. Never confuse the two. Ethan carefully folded the letter. Beneath it lay a second envelope marked. Open only after reading my letter. Inside were certified legal documents, property deeds, trust agreements, historical records. Ethan's eyes widened. The 40 acres surrounding the farmhouse had never been ordinary farmland. Decades earlier, his grandfather had quietly acquired neighboring parcels whenever he could afford them. Those purchases, combined with mineral rights that had remained in the family for generations, had become part of a protected family trust. The land itself was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Not because of the old farmhouse, but because of everything hidden beneath and around it. His grandfather had deliberately kept that knowledge private. Even Ethan hadn't known. Margaret smiled softly. He wanted the family to value the house for its memories, not its price. Ethan looked around the attic. For the first time all day, he smiled, not because of the money, because Olivia had unknowingly revealed exactly who she was before learning the truth. Had she discovered the land's value first, she could always have claimed she loved him despite the farmhouse. Now, there would never be any doubt. He carefully returned every document to the chest. Then he reached into his pocket and took out the engagement ring. He placed it gently beside the letter. That chapter is over. Margaret nodded. What comes next? Ethan's expression changed. The heartbreak was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He pulled out his phone. His chief financial officer, Daniel Harper, answered almost immediately. Ethan, everything okay? No, Ethan replied calmly. But it will be. I need you to do 3 things. I'm listening. Cancel every wedding arrangement. Done. Remove Olivia Brooks from every company guest list, charity board invitation, and family trust event. I'll take care of it. Daniel hesitated. And the third. Ethan looked out through the attic window toward the long gravel driveway where Olivia had disappeared. I want a complete, lawful investigation into Brandon Hayes and Olivia Brooks. Business dealings, financial connections, public records. If there's a truth hiding in plain sight, I want to know it. Daniel didn't ask questions. "I'll start immediately." After ending the call, Ethan slipped the brass key back into his pocket. He looked around the attic one final time. His grandfather hadn't left him revenge. He had left him perspective. Olivia believed she had walked away from a bankrupt man, trapped in a worthless old farmhouse. She never realized she had abandoned the richest part of Ethan's life, his character. And soon, she would learn that betraying an honest man was far more dangerous than underestimating a billionaire. End of part 1.